I'm tapping my inner Theo Vaughn. Hey, do we have that clip?
Yeah.
Let's play that clip, brother.
I have a heterodox view of that podcast. I thought it was some of the most intriguing sound I've heard recently.
You think that's a heterodox view? I share the view.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show where we bring you conversations about the news stories on our minds. I'm Charles Lane, Deputy Opinions Editor, and this week we're going to talk about how the presidential candidates are turning to podcasts in this final stretch of the campaign. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are trying to target specific voting groups, and so they're going on influential lifestyle podcasts with easygoing hosts. These interviews may not be hard-hitting, but what, if anything, do they reveal about the candidates that we haven't already heard? I'm joined by two of my colleagues who've done some homework. They've been listening to these often quite long podcast interviews, and we're going to get into what we heard and how it differs from what we hear at debates or rallies or political conventions. Could you both introduce yourselves?
I'm Molly Roberts. I'm an editorial writer and columnist at The Post.
And I'm Perry Bacon, and I'm one of the columnists here.
So let's start with Vice President Harris, who many voters, maybe they feel they don't know her as well because it's a shortened, for her anyway, a shortened campaign this year. In the last couple of weeks, she has blitzed the podcast scene, appearing on Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy, which is one of the most popular podcasts in the country, and All the Smoke, hosted by two former NBA players, as well as the Howard Stern Show. Molly, let's start with you. Do you feel you learned anything new about her by listening to these shows?
I don't really think I learned anything new. To me, it felt more like a confirmation of things I already knew about her. And of course, there was more emphasis on aspects of her personal story that she'd already been pretty clear about in her convention speech, for example.
So, Perry?
Maybe this is out there already, but there was some facts I didn't learn. I guess their first date, he picks her up. Her husband picks her up in a BMW, and then he announces to her that he's a bad driver, which I thought was a weird move for a first date. So she, at the end, is asked something with the NBA podcast about who she would want to have dinner with if she could have a dream group. And she mentions the two Justins, the legislators from Tennessee who were expelled for a while. She mentions Thurgood Marshall. She mentions Charlie Chisholm. You know, it gave me a sense of like the kind of people she finds interesting, and that was helpful in a certain way. Nothing broadly different, but it was an interesting listen.
Yeah, I learned she likes nacho-flavored Doritos. That was the salient new fact I learned about her. But you're right, we learned some new stuff about Doug.
So I want to drill down on specific exchanges or moments in these Harris podcasts that might have stood out for you. And maybe think about it this way, something you heard on these podcasts that you would never have come up in a conventional 60 Minutes or, ABC News interview.
Sure. I mean, Harris talked a lot about her mother in the Call Her Daddy podcast, and I think that was certainly humanizing. She talked about her mother while she was running for Attorney General of California on the hospital bed, dying of cancer.
Let's play that clip.
She leaned over to me and she said, "What's going on with the race?" And then she leaned back over and I said, "Well, Mommy, they said they're going to kick my ass." At which point my mother turned her head, looked at me, and had the biggest smile. Had the biggest smile ever. That was my mother.
I like that because I think that it was an insight not only into what Kamala Harris's mother thought about the race and the other races she's run in, but kind of about what Kamala thought too, and perhaps her attitude toward the way that people and Donald Trump are dismissive of her, particularly at a time when he's saying she's mentally impaired and a low IQ individual and stuff like that.
She talked a lot about, with the NBA players, about sort of being a stepmom.
Let's play that clip.
They are my children.
Absolutely.
And, we talk about we have a modern family, and maybe the blessing that I have that not everyone has, although I think everyone should try and work on it, is I have a very close, because it is a very respectful relationship with their mother.
It's important.
And so
That ain't easy.
That's rare.
No, it's not. It is not, and you have to work at it.
You're giving me a hot flash. Hold on.
But you have to work at it. You'll be all right.
She's really kind of leaned into that as part of our identity in a certain way. We've had blended families before in the White House, but I think it is striking how much she talks about that and how much that is a part of her persona. And she uses the phrase, we're a modern family. Obama ran as kind of the perfect nuclear family. And I think Harris is something a little bit different. So there was a long discourse about that in the podcast about what it's like to be part of, be a step parent. Or one of the basketball players talks about that too. And that was kind of fun to listen to.
So one of the aspects of both candidates going on podcasts that I find super fascinating and possibly brand new in politics is that these are gendered shows. Going on Call Her Daddy for Harris is like a clear pitch to young women. All the Smoke, which is the one hosted by the NBA stars, is a way to reach Black men, apparently. Molly, do you think they got what they were looking for? Were these effective in reaching these audiences?
Yeah, they're definitely identity-coded podcasts. I think that Call Her Daddy not only is speaking to women, but it's speaking to young women, to young millennials and Gen Z women, which is probably useful to some extent, although I'm not convinced that those people weren't leaning Harris anyway. Maybe it'll motivate them to go out and vote. In my opinion, if Harris really needs to speak to women, she might need to speak to older women in swing states rather than the women I'm guessing are listening to Call Her Daddy. But I'm sure it didn't hurt. And it certainly gave her a chance to focus on women's issues on which she is strongest, partly because she's a woman, so she can speak with a lot of authenticity and credibility.
Okay, I want to turn to Trump's choice of podcasts and whether we heard anything new and different there. But first, let's take a quick break.
Hi, this is Megan McArdle. I'm a journalist and opinion columnist here at The Post. And today I want to recommend the podcast called Reflector. Reflector's team and I recently did 3 episodes where we dove deep into America's political history of making claims that a U.S. election was stolen.
A lot of Republicans believe that the election was stolen, and they want Nixon to fight. And Nixon doesn't. He concedes.
Once the decision is made, we unite behind the man who was elected.
I know that many listeners are always on the hunt for a new podcast, and Reflector's not only a place to find great stories. They're also committed to fairness, independence, and nonpartisanship in their coverage of even some of the thorniest issues facing our society. To listen, just search Reflector in whatever app you're using to listen to this podcast right now. And thanks.
Welcome back. I'm Charles Lane, and this is Impromptu. So let's talk about Donald Trump's podcast appearances. He's been president or running for president for nearly a decade at this point, and of course has been in the public eye for a lot longer than that. So many Americans already feel like they know him. But in recent months, he's been going on some popular comedy podcasts, including This Past Weekend with Theo Vaughn and Flagrant. So I'm going to ask you, starting with you, Perry, the same question we did with Harris. What was your impression of Trump on these podcasts, and was it any different from the impression you form from other venues?
As openly not a Trump fan, I found these podcasts to be interesting in that they humanized him. Both the host asked a lot of questions about him being a parent, what his relationship with his kids was like, and Donald Trump loves his kids, as everyone does probably, but he discussed it in some detail. That was interesting. With Theo Vaughn, there's a long discussion about Trump's brother and how he was addicted to alcohol, and that's in part why Trump doesn't drink.
Let's play that clip.
He'd say, don't ever drink, don't ever drink. He'd tell me every time, I said, don't ever drink, because he knew he had this addiction. And I never had a glass of alcohol. Never, ever did I have a glass of alcohol because of him. And I would say that if I did drink, I could, conceivably be the type of personality that would have, like you, that would have a problem.
I assume some people in the world knew that. I didn't know a lot about that. And that was actually a pretty detailed, interesting, revealing, a kind of a kind, empathetic side of Donald Trump, I would say even. So there were not a lot of new facts about public policy, but I get a sense of sort of how Donald Trump sees the world in a more favorable. This podcast definitely made me more favorably inclined to Donald Trump than I usually am. So it definitely worked on that in that sense.
Yeah, it was one of the only times I had heard Trump so engaged, whether he was talking about UFC, which he appears to be a big fan of and knows a lot about. He was talking also about the first fight he ever saw, and he seemed to have this vivid memory in his head about it. And it wasn't just a story about him. It was a story about two great fighters fighting, not him fighting, which is usually what we hear about. And then he was really interested also in Theo Von through that vehicle of his brother and his brother's struggles with addiction. He was talking to Theo Von about Theo Von's addiction. And he even didn't want to talk about policy later. He was supposed to be talking about opioid policy, but he wanted to pivot back to Theo Von's addiction.
Do we have that clip? Let's play it.
Oh, well, all of that is horrible. But
How
why
did
do
you
we
get
allow
How
that
did
to
you get addicted? How did?
No, I would just do cocaine. That was really, yeah. So not just, yeah.
That's
was
down and dirty, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it was, yeah.
But you don't anymore?
No, I don't do it anymore, man, and I'm not doing it.
Is it too much? Too much to handle?
Some of the stuff started to get a real rattle in it, too. I don't know where we were even getting it from in this country, but yeah, it started to make me feel like I was a mechanic or something.
So the thing you go back to then is alcohol for the most part.
Right, yeah, but what I want probably is cocaine, but I know that if I have a drink, then it'll be like, okay, well, I had a drink, then I can do this.
Is cocaine a stronger
oh, yeah.
up?
Yeah. Cocaine will make
you're way up with cocaine more than anything else you can think of.
Cocaine will turn you into a damn owl, homie, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You'll be out on your own porch, you know, and you'll be your own street lamp.
I mean, it just sounded like a real person, and not just a real person, but an interested person. To hear him talk about anyone but himself was fascinating.
I felt I was, sort of a fly on the wall at any of the sort of 20 or 30-something young men sitting around their living rooms, talking about stuff. It sort of had that atmosphere to it. I would just say, like, what I also found revealing was what Trump wouldn't say. So it was really interesting. He was asked a great question. What do you admire or like about your sons? And he mentioned they were both great hunters. And he started talking about how their grandfather used to take them hunting in Czechoslovakia. And Theo Von asked, "Oh, was it your father?" And he said, "No, it was their grandfather." And of course, what he's not saying, what he's avoiding, is it must have been his first wife, Ivana Trump's father, who was from that part of the world, who took them hunting. But there was something about it, like he just couldn't go there. And it sort of indirectly you learn about I don't know, I guess that's just a sort of still a sore point for him.
I thought the hunting answer was very interesting because it is not the first thing you would think that any father would say that he admired about his son. And you would also think that if Trump were trying to come up with the appealing answer, the quote-unquote humanizing answer, he would find something that feels a little deeper than that. I think if Kamala Harris had been doing the interview, she would have said something that feels a little deeper than that. I don't know if that would have been the true answer, right? But I think even in these interviews she was doing, she was sticking to her talking points. She's better at having a conversation or seeming like she is than Trump is. But the Theo Von one, not only was he finally really having a conversation, I think he was being, in kind of a Trumpian fashion, quite genuine with it too.
Yeah, but I also felt that part was political. I thought he was remembering, okay, I got to double down on the Second Amendment and show that my family, because I'm sure Trump himself doesn't really hunt, but he was trying to connect with his base. So, Perry, why comedy podcasts?
Having not listened to these podcasts before, I later on learned they were comedy podcasts, and at times there was some humor that was brought up, but it felt like more like these are male podcast than not that women can't listen to them, but it felt like very much I am trying to appeal to the sort of male under 45. And I thought that sort of worked in that Trump came off less old than he usually does. And I think that was what I took away from this mostly. And he did seem more relaxed.
So last question. These candidates are not coming here to the Washington Post or other journalistic outlets to get their message out. I mean, Trump blatantly skipped on the 60 Minutes interview. They're going to podcasts where they can pretty much be sure they'll get softball questions from comedians, athletes, lifestyle influencers, not professional journalists. What does that tell you about this cultural moment?
I think one thing that it says that is a hallmark of the internet age is that increasingly we are separated into silos. And so the idea is that you can more easily appeal to people going silo by silo. You know exactly who you're talking to depending on the venue where you're talking to them. And so you can tailor your message perfectly there. We don't have as clear a mainstream way to appeal to people perhaps as we did, I think.
Perry?
So what I found frustrating about this was that Call Her Daddy was a little bit different, but I thought the Flagrant podcast, the Theo Von, and the basketball players, it was like listening to, if you watch Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel, they have guests on their softball, but they still do interviews and they still are asking questions. And a lot of these I felt like was like, I am a supporter of candidate X. I want to have a conversation that helps move people in my audience to vote for candidate X and like them better. So I don't want to ask any question that's off balance or puts them on defensive. I don't mind going on talk shows, avoiding 60 Minutes, avoiding, boring newscasts. I don't love the podcast strategy where you're sort of going to talk to a semi-supporter who's trying to maximize your vote share in a certain way. And there's something off about this format, I think.
Yeah, I keep coming back to the gender aspect. I think we are going to see this year a record gender gap. And I think it's going to be record in young people. It's going to be like we're going to see like young women and young men basically inhabiting kind of different headspaces on a massive scale. And these podcasts are what happens when very realistic, political consultants survey the media landscape and try to maximize their advantage out of it. And in that way, the mere existence of these interviews is already a very powerful comment on what's happening politically in our country. So with that, we're out of time. This was in the manner of that famous Seinfeld episode where Kramer came up with a coffee table book about coffee tables. We have done a podcast about podcasts. Thank you both, Molly Roberts and Perry Bacon, for making it so insightful and interesting.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Chuck.
We'll be sure to put a link to all the podcasts we talked about in this podcast in our show notes. Before you go, here's a bit of humor on this subject with our very own columnist, Alexandra Petri.
I understand that the topic under discussion was the presidential candidates going on podcasts. I'm not deep enough in the internet to know everyone who does interviews and podcasts. They're people with millions of followers, much more famous than I will ever be, but I'm simply in the wrong ecosystem to have ever heard of them. So instead of recommending different additional podcasts, I thought it might be better to suggest some other different styles of interview that I, for one, would like to see the candidates try. Here are 6-ish. Number 1, something where they get quizzed on an area of expertise. Like, Go Fact Yourself. I was on Go Fact Yourself, and it's fun, because if you get a trivia question wrong, then the person you got it wrong about is there to judge you. Number 2, Masked Singer? No, in retrospect, I think it's better to save that for after the campaign, like Sarah Palin. Or, on further reflection, maybe better actually to go to your grave not having done Masked Singer. Number 3, one of those interviews where you eat something. People suggested hot ones. I don't think it has to be hot ones. I think I'm just most curious to watch Donald Trump eat anything whatsoever. Ron DeSantis had finger pudding gate, and you can get quickly sunk as a candidate by not eating food in a normal manner. Like if you eat your pizza with a knife and fork. Number 4, Get Ready With Me video. Again, I'm most interested in this for Trump specifically. I would love to know what he puts on his face. Just want to watch his morning routine. And in that same interview family, there's videos where you go through what's in your purse or bag, the Vanity Fair lie detector test. Number 5, totally different category, a spelling bee. I love a spelling bee. 5.5. The puppy interview. Again, I just want to watch Donald Trump try to have a normal interaction with a dog. Number 6, Jeopardy! I think Jeopardy would be a fun format for a candidate forum. They can go on at the same time against each other, or they can compete separately. Mr. Trump can even bring his own set of facts. Let's see how far that gets him.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson, edited by Damir Marusik, Chris Sulentrop, and Allison Michaels, and mixed by Emma Munger. Chris Rucan designed our art. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please let us know what you thought of today's show by emailing impromptu@washpost.com. And if you enjoy listening, leave us a review. We wouldn't object if you make it 5 stars.